Welcome to the Smith Family Foundation debate. My name is Bob Bowdon. We appreciate you being here. This month's topic, should America be energy independent? And we have an excellent group of guests here to speak to you this evening. We will hear from Rick Duke with the National Resource Defense Council. He comes to NRDC from McKinsey & Company, where he consulted on strategy, operations, and organization. Also, number two, Frank Gaffney Jr., President and CEO of the Center for Security Policy. He's the author of War Footing, 10 Steps America Must Take to Prevail in the War for the Free World. And third, speaking today, Jerry Taylor, Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute, author of Don't Increase Federal Gasoline Taxes, Abolish Them. So today's subject is very relevant and pertinent these days. I wanted to first say that right now, gasoline is at $3.05 a gallon on average across the country. That's a 37% increase from a year ago. Crude oil for December delivery closed today at $93.97 a barrel. That is up 61% from a year ago. As we all know, importing oil has created political problems for the United States, not so much, though, with our number one exporter to the U.S., which is Canada. A lot of people don't know that. But then rounding out the list of the main exporters to the U.S., Saudi Arabia, Mexico, Venezuela, Nigeria, and the sixth leading exporter of oil to the U.S. in the month of September, according to DOE data released just today, Iraq, the sixth leading exporter. Amidst that, we had some news yesterday from Kumamoto, Japan. A new company opened a production facility to make thin-film solar cells to create electricity from the sun. You may not know that story, but you know the company. It's Honda. They've said they'll have 80 distribution locations throughout Japan. They already have 80, and by the end of next year, they're going to have 200 distributors. I don't know if that means they're dealers, but 200 distributors Honda will have for solar cells by the end of next year. And also, we had one other piece of news I'll give you is that NRG Energy filed an application to build 2 new nuclear reactors in Texas the month before last, about 7 weeks ago. It had not happened in 30 years. The Christian Science Monitor ran a piece called Nuclear Power Surge Coming, in which they said the NRC is expecting up to 28 new applications for nuclear power plants in the next 15 months. And it has forced some tricky answers from environmental activists like Al Gore, who've been asked to select the lesser of environmental evils between CO2 and nuclear waste. Of course, nuclear plants don't create greenhouse gases. So there are many subjects we can discuss tonight, and we'll get right to it, starting with Rick Duke of the NRDC.
Good evening, and thanks for the opportunity to participate in the panel. I'll start by answering the question in saying that we need to reframe the question. I think that what we're not pursuing is energy independence for its own sake, but rather economic and environmental security. And in some cases, a blind pursuit of energy independence can actually be at cross purposes with those fundamental objectives. And I want to cover 3 main points in my brief remarks. The first is that we do need to focus on those objectives, not energy independence per se. The second is that, thankfully, there are some excellent technical solutions that can allow us to achieve those objectives over coming decades and at a very reasonable cost, or even while saving money for the economy. And then the third is that we know the market-based approaches that will allow us to get down that path in a hurry. So let me start with a discussion of why it is that we need to redefine the question. Fundamentally, if we pursue energy independence in its own right as a goal, we run into various risks, one of which is that we will seriously exacerbate the challenge of global warming. I don't want to get into a deep digression on that, but suffice it to say that some of the exports from Canada referred to by the moderator of oil sands, for example, some of the proposals for coal to liquids using conventional technologies, all will involve radical increases in the CO2 per gallon of gasoline that we consume. And that's a price that we can't afford to pay given the challenge that we face in controlling global warming emissions. I would also point out that if we were to achieve energy independence for the United States, the benefits in terms of our own national security would be ephemeral. And the point there is that we haven't imported oil from Iran for over 25 years due to legal restrictions on our ability to import from Iran. Even if the U.S. were fully, completely independent of any kind of imports of oil, we would still be connected to those markets through the international economy. And so it's impossible for us to decouple from the international picture in this regard, and therefore we need to look for different approaches. That brings me to the question of what are the solutions that we should be driving for from a technical perspective. And I want to stick mainly to the topic of oil. And let me point out 3 strategies that we can use in order to move towards reducing the risk that we face to our economy and our environment through the crude oil dependence that we currently have globally, not just in the US. The first is, of course, fuel economy in vehicles. And that includes everything from hybrid electric vehicles to also the way we design our cities. We need to have encouragement of the opportunity to design more dense cities with lower transportation requirements. Second is to move towards substitutes. And with the right rules in place, the market is extremely good at delivering substitutes. Brief digression, The Economist has put together a survey of the top commodities in use for the last 150 years. And the real price of those commodities has fallen, and fallen with some variation. But over the last 150 years, that's the magic of the market in place when the rules are written correctly to allow it to work. So we can do biofuels and other substitutes for crude, which are environmentally clean as well as helping our national security. And then finally, when we look down the line, let's say in the 2030 to 2050 timeframe, once the electricity grid is cleaned up and decarbonized, we should be looking to solutions like plugging in electric vehicles in order to use electricity for providing our transportation needs, and at that point, clean electricity, we hope. Now, how do we get there? There are a set of clear policy tools that we can use in order to make all this happen, and I'm not suggesting, by the way, that any of this is easy or that any of it is automatic. It will require a very concerted effort to rewrite the rules so that industry is able to scale up solutions efficiently. And I would just cite a few things briefly. One, let's free up the zoning requirements that sometimes make it impossible for developers to do compact development, and make it possible for smart growth to flourish, especially as the population ages and more people are empty nesters and looking for the opportunity to live in dense developments. Two, let's make sure that we use the tool of CAFE standards or similar approaches that have been proven in the past to create radical increases in fuel economy. And remember, consumers don't generally pay close attention to the fuel economy of their vehicles when they're making a decision to buy. Of late, there's more attention because prices are high, but we need some kind of a mechanism to force manufacturers to bring that into the equation, even when consumers are not paying close enough attention or not sufficiently well informed to make good decisions. Third, we need to provide the right kinds of incentives to develop the right kind of biofuels. And we may want to get into that in more depth as we go along, but certain kinds of biofuels like grain-based ethanol are not helping us in terms of our climate change problem because they involve too much fuel in the production of the grain ethanol itself. There are, of course, as many of you I'm sure are well aware, lots of new technologies coming down the pike which can absolutely solve our our energy challenge and our economic and environmental challenge simultaneously, things like cellulosic ethanol. And then I would just mention that on the natural gas side, there are a couple things that we have to do as well in order to manage demand for electricity so that we keep our demand for electricity and the natural gas used to generate electricity in check. And that involves making sure that utilities are able to make money by reducing demand rather than only from selling more power. And final note on the question of natural gas, as needed, we need to also be open to developing more liquefied natural gas terminals so that we can increase the supply of natural gas available to our economy at a reasonable price. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rick. Next up, Frank Gaffney, founder and president, CEO, Center for Security Policy.
Thank you very much. I, too, am delighted to be here tonight. It's hard to imagine a more topical subject in the middle of a market that is being roiled by, among other things, the kinds of shocks, strategic as well as economic, deriving from the perception that there may be a war in the Middle East that will affect the supply of oil that emanates from there, putting prices at $90+ a barrel and probably going higher before it improves. As a result, coming at this topic as I do from a national security perspective, I have to say that I think the proposition that we should be working for energy independence is really a no-brainer. It's a question of how do you do it, and what sense of urgency do we attach to this? And when we are striving for energy independence, what exactly is it we're seeking? So let me try to talk very quickly through those three basic issues. Indisputably, today, as a result of the dependency that we currently have on particularly oil, we use a lot of different energy sources for a lot of different purposes. The most troubling, however, is the amount of energy that we use to power our transportation sector that comes from places like the Middle East, that are at best unstable and at worst downright hostile to us. Other suppliers are not much better, including many of the countries in Africa now, the Venezuelans. Needless to say, Russia is of greater and greater concern. To the extent that we find ourselves transferring ever-increasing amounts of national wealth to people in one or more of those countries who are, again, at best, unreliable partners in this kind of energy program, and at worst, actually hostile to us. It's at best, again, a dubious proposition, and at worst, it's a completely untenable arrangement. So, to the extent that we find ourselves looking to these kinds of countries to supply something as critical to our national security as well as our economic well-being as oil is, used predominantly, not exclusively by any means, but predominantly in the transportation sector. We don't use oil to speak of to power the electrical grid. We do use it for other applications, pharmaceuticals and fertilizers and the like, but most of the oil that we consume, and certainly most that we consume most profligately, is going into our gas tanks of one kind or another and being burned up to get us from point A to point B. The dangers associated with transferring enormous wealth to people who have this checkered record is something I think obvious to all of us since 9/11. Terrorism is enabled by the uses that people who are selling us or others in the West oil use those funds to make possible. There is, in addition, a growing awareness that these flows of oil are highly susceptible to disruption, including terrorism, but even natural or man-made unintended hazards, like we're seeing washing ashore in San Francisco Bay at the moment. We came perilously close to having a huge problem in the flow of oil from Saudi Arabia because a truck bomber did not get through the last security obstacle. We managed to avoid what would have assuredly been $100 a barrel oil a few years ago, and far higher still today in all likelihood, because it would have taken time to restore that productive capacity. Being here in New York, the home of American capitalism, I have to say there's a new danger that I think is not widely appreciated just yet, that is going probably to cause the others to pale by comparison. It is a phenomenon that is coming to be known as Islamic banking or Sharia-compliant finance. Why is that a problem? It is a problem because it legitimates the practice of Sharia. And if that is a term that is unfamiliar to you, the easy way to understand what it means is it is the religious and political code applied by the Taliban. or by the Saudis, or by the Sudanese, or by the Iranian regime. Hardly the sort of thing that one would anticipate bankers, investment houses, hedge fund managers, and others in the West who, I'm quite certain, prize our way of life, our freedoms, the opportunities we afford women and other human beings to be subjected to. And yet that is one of the things that is coming about as a result of the recycling of petrodollars, the legitimation of this concept that Sharia is an appropriate way not only for Muslims to govern themselves, but increasingly, as is the ideological purpose of those who promote it, to have all of us subjected to it. A second aspect of this that is quite worrying is that the people who are determining whether a given investment is Sharia compliant or not happen to be among the most extreme adherents to this radical Islamist, or if you will, Islamo-fascist ideology. And they're being employed by banks all over this country and indeed increasingly all over the world, with real implications, I believe, for not only what's being done with those investments, but the companies they're working for, the companies they're investing in. Finally, there's the issue of Zakat, the concept of tithing, which makes the money available through the profits of these kinds of operations part of a revenue stream that is migrating inevitably into the hands of people who are hostile to us. A very frightening prospect indeed. Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, madrasas all over the world, and of course Al-Qaeda are among the beneficiaries of this zakat. And under Islamic banking in America and elsewhere in the West, it's our money, not just Muslims' money, not just petrodollars that are beginning to move into those funds. What do we do about this? We've talked a little bit already about some of the ideas. I happen to think that we should eschew notions that are politically undoable. There's arguments that can be made for CAFE standards. There's arguments that can be made for offshore drilling or tar sand exploitation in ways that seem rapacious to some. What we can all agree upon, I think, is flexible fuel vehicles, a means of equipping cars for about $100 a pop, newly manufactured cars, with the ability to use any kind of gasoline, ethanol, or methanol, or some combination thereof. This and bringing electricity into the fuel mix for vehicles through plug-in hybrids is, I think, a way to go. It enjoys broad bipartisan support, and it's the sort of thing we ought to be doing to garner or at least push forward towards energy independence. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. And third on the agenda is Jerry Taylor, Senior Fellow, Cato Institute. Jerry.
Good evening. It's a real pleasure to be here. My job tonight is to give you a long, cool sip of Econ 101. Let me remind you of something. We import oil for a reason, because it's cheaper than getting it from here at home. We are all alarmed about the increasing cost of oil and gasoline. I can guarantee you with absolute certainty that if we were to reduce imports, prices would be higher, not lower. I remind you again, we import for a reason. It's cheaper to get that oil from abroad than to produce it here at home. If it were otherwise, we would not import at all. The case for oil imports, or the case for tolerating oil imports, is the same as the case for free trade in general. There is no BTU exception to Adam Smith's wealth of nations. Now, whether you're concerned about an environmental apocalypse coming from the book of Revelations and climate change and whatnot, or whether you're concerned about Islamic terrorists indoctrinating our children and make them ululate at Disneyland, is beside the point for the purposes of this conversation. Because regardless of whether you're concerned about environmental apocalypse or Islamo-fascist apocalypse, energy independence does nothing to reduce the possibility of either consequence. For instance, Frank Gaffney mentioned that, well, we don't like the fact that oil producers in the Middle East get a lot of money from the oil trade, from U.S. consumers. Well, maybe we don't. But if the United States spent its money not on Saudi crude or Bahraini crude or Kuwaiti crude or Iraqi crude, and instead spent it on, say, Mexican crude or Canadian crude and Texas crude, it wouldn't make any difference. Profits would be the same abroad as they are today. Why? Because the price of oil is dictated by global supply and demand considerations, and Saudi Arabia would make just as much profit whether we bought oil from them directly or not. Energy independence per se will not reduce the profitability of oil in the Persian Gulf, nor will it have much effect on terrorism. After all, again, independence per se does not reduce oil profits or oil price. But even if we could somehow do that through some miracle combination of government R&D and plug-in hybrids, and maybe we could enslave gerbils and run them on treadwheels and run our cars that way. But even if we could do that and drop oil prices from 95 a barrel to, say, 15 a barrel, a huge drop, we would see prices that we saw normally in the 1990s. Were the 1990s a long desert for Islamic terrorists? No. It was the very decade that Islamic terrorism came of age. It was the decade of Hezbollah coming of age, of Hamas coming of age, of al-Qaeda launching its first strikes. If oil prices at even 1/9 of what they are today were not capable of strangling Islamic terrorism, in fact, we're perfectly capable of allowing Islamic terrorists to get on their feet and begin to throw their first punches, I rather doubt that anything we do with regards to ethanol or anything else is going to make Osama bin Laden give up the ghost and, say, turn to a falafel business. Now, of course, when we rely on oil, we rely on imports, and they're susceptible to disruption abroad. That's certainly true. But even if all of our oil came from a hole in the ground in Kansas, even if we were entirely energy independent, a supply disruption abroad would have the same economic impact as if all our oil came from abroad. Why? Because, again, oil prices are established by global supply and demand considerations. We know this intuitively, after all. We worry about what would happen if the United States launched a preemptive strike in Iran, right? We worry about what would happen to world crude oil prices. Why? We don't import any oil from Iran. We don't get a drop. It's against the law. There's an embargo. But we know that if Iranian oil disappears from the market, the price of crude everywhere goes up in price. That's why energy independence per se is no hedge against supply disruption. It's no protection. In 1978, for instance, Great Britain was energy independent. It had reached that holy land that all our presidential candidates tell us that they will bring us to. And yet, the fall of the Shah of Iran and the loss of Iranian crude sent British crude oil prices just as high as the price of Japanese crude, even though Japan was entirely dependent on oil imports and Great Britain were energy independent. So energy independence per se doesn't make much difference. Well, would energy independence at least protect us from this vaunted oil weapon that we're often reminded about? The sword of Damocles that hangs over our economic head? No. Why? Because embargoes are make-believe events. When producers sell oil into the market, oil goes where markets dictate, not where the producers dictate. All that happened in 1973 during the vaunted oil embargo is instead of buying oil from the Saudis, we bought oil from people who bought oil from the Saudis. And then we also added some of our demand was shifted to non-OPEC producers who used to sell to somebody else. They now sold to us, and those old consumers were kicked off to OPEC. And we had a little game of musical chairs, but there was no reduction in oil imports in the United States. In 1971, we imported 1.7 million barrels a day. In 1972, 2.2 million barrels a day. 1973, in the teeth of the embargo, 3.2 million barrels a day. 1974, 3.5 million barrels a day. Embargoes are make-believe events. For those of you who are old enough to remember the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, you might recall that we tried this game ourselves. It was the grain embargo that we imposed on the Soviet Union to try to get them out of Afghanistan. It didn't last long. Why? Because U.S. grain was finding its way into the Soviet Union within months of the announcement of that embargo. How did that happen? Because U.S. grain is sold on international markets. It goes to wherever buyers want to take it. So embargoes are make-believe events. We don't have to worry about them either. Well, at least if we get our oil from someplace else, at least it'd be more reliable, right? Let's assume, for instance, we were sending it to Nebraska and Iowa corn sheiks as opposed to the oil sheiks in Saudi Arabia. At least corn supplies are more reliable, right? Wrong again. If you look at production data from 1960 to 2005, you'll find that variations in corn harvests were twice as great as variations in oil imports into the United States. In other words, by moving away from oil to something else, we trade geopolitical risks for far greater natural risks. Drought, hot weather, and if climate change is truly around the corner, that will even be worse. My point here is not necessarily to get into a long dispute about biofuels or ethanol or energy conservation. I'm happy to do that. I would be delighted to do that for you. But it's beside the point. The topic this evening is energy independence. Now, again, you can believe what you like and you can have whichever fears you like, but whatever they may be, energy independence per se has nothing to do with solving the problems that might vex you tonight. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Okay. Now we're going to enter the rebuttal period. It's going to be about 2 minutes or so. You guys could just stay there. Actually, no, I take it back. You guys are coming to the podium again. So first rebuttal, coming up. You first.
I think that in terms of rebutting the arguments that have made from the panel so far, there's really more agreement than disagreement from my perspective. So let me try to find an area of quibbling. I think really what I want to do is take advantage of the 2 minutes to point out that indeed energy independence is the wrong goal, but we do need to keep our eye fixed on the question of how do we reduce energy consumption in order to meet the twin goals of economic and environmental security. And with that comes national security. And so fundamentally what I'd like to do is make sure that in putting aside, I hope, the notion that energy independence per se is a legitimate way to address our problems, we don't put aside the possibility of very serious public policy solutions, market-based public policy solutions, to ensure that we do reduce the amount of oil that we use, to make sure that we do attenuate our demand for natural gas used to produce electricity, and in so doing improve the economic productivity of our entire country, and by the way, in so doing create in effect a public service to the entire international economy, because indeed our economies are completely linked in terms of the oil flows and in terms of the trade flows that come from the energy that we consume in each of our respective countries. And so to the extent that the U.S. is able to step off the gas in terms of how much oil we're consuming, that will help attenuate these high crude oil prices that everyone is suffering from. Whether or not that flows into national security benefits is a question that you can debate, although I'm sympathetic to the arguments from Frank that there would be some reduction in the petrodollars to some typically and even systematically troubled states that often cause us trouble. What is very clear is that would lead to a boost to global GDP growth and would be good for the planet. So let's make sure that we keep our eye on the ball here, even once we redefine the question of what we're trying to achieve.
I find myself in these debates with Jerry constantly talking about economics, and I want to talk about national security, but let me just make a point about economics. If the strategy that I'm talking about is employed, ideally, and I think this is in fact what would happen, not just by this country, but by both the developed world and the developing world, diversifying the kinds of fuels that we can use in our transportation sector so that we are not dependent upon oil. Oil becomes another commodity, not a monopolistic commodity, not a commodity that we depend upon critically, both, as I say, for national security and economic purposes, but another commodity. A friend of mine, and Corin, frequently points to salt as a commodity that once upon a time enjoyed a prized place because it was critical to human survival, but that ultimately ceased to have that kind of place in the world economy or in, for that matter, the security of nations. American manufacturers know how to produce flexible fuel vehicles. There are 5 million of them on the road today. Every car manufacturer could ramp up that production dramatically. In fact, they've promised to do so, make 50% of their fleets flexible fuel vehicle capable in the next 5 years. That could be done far faster if we as a nation said that's what we want. Every car sold in America starting maybe the next model year, having this capability, $100 a car, essentially a chip in the carburetor and some plumbing that's slightly different fittings. This is, again, a no-brainer. It doesn't change things overnight, but it begins to change things, and I think could change things dramatically if the United States takes the lead, if the American president and Congress get behind this on a bipartisan basis and urge our people to make this kind of investment in new vehicles with these features and the attendant fuels coming on stream as they will once that demand is available. And we will be moving markedly in the direction of energy independence. Thank you.
Well, at this point, it might be a bit unsporting just to declare that I've won and we can go home, because now the debate is about oil independence, not energy independence. And I'm happy to engage in that discussion. But energy independence doesn't seem to be any longer on the table. Now we're discussing, or at least Frank and Rick are discussing, whether we need to be independent of oil. Well, let's have that conversation. How best can we reduce oil consumption? How about this? Leave prices alone. How many people are running for president who say we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, carbon emissions, and whatnot, and then they also want to go prosecute price gouging oil executives? Let me tell you something. If oil executives are price gouging, if energy companies are taking unfair advantage of consumers, then my friend John Pescandano, who's head of Greenpeace, ought to put those people on his board of directors, because they're doing environmentalists a favor. They are reducing consumption below where it needs to be. With oil prices as high as they are, we don't need to jigger with the market to provide artificial incentives for people to invest in alternatives. The incentives are certainly there. And we see them every day in the newspaper. We read about Richard Branson and Bill Gates and other venture capitalists like Vinod Khosla throwing billions of dollars into alternative fuels and into speculative technologies to compete with oil. And I have no complaint with that, and God bless them, and I hope they pan out. I have no particular complaint if we can move our cars with Tayloronium as opposed to gasoline. But the point is, the market is providing all the necessary signals to steer investments in that direction, and if there is indeed merit in any of these technologies, they will be disgorged by the market without our politicians having to lift a finger. Now, Frank Gaffney says, well, that might be so, but we need to help flex-fueled vehicles. Somehow that's the magic answer. I don't know if that's true. I have no particular complaint with flex-fueled vehicles. I wasn't hardwired at birth to loathe them. But I will note that if they're flex-fueled, that implies that consumers would want to use something else besides gasoline to run them. Like what? Ethanol? Ethanol, even given today's gasoline prices, is still running 42 cents a gallon more expensive than conventional crude after you correct for the BTU differential between the two fuels. In other words, if there aren't subsidies or mandates or hammers to my head, and a consumer is asked to put gasoline or to spend 42 cents a gallon more to put that ethanol in his tank, he isn't going to touch ethanol. You don't need to take my word for it. Ask the Renewable Fuels Association, the main lobbying group for the ethanol industry, what would happen if government mandates for ethanol consumption and subsidies were to disappear. They'll tell you their industry disappears. Flex fuel vehicles don't help us very much until something can compete with gasoline. And the fact is, nothing can compete with gasoline, even given these record high prices. I don't know whether that'll always be the case. I know it would be great, again, if we could find something that could compete with gasoline. But I can tell you that having the government involve itself by subsidizing technologies and picking winners and rigging the market to advantage some investments relative to others is not a very intelligent way to go about this. If it were, we'd have fusion-powered plants outside of every one of our towns and cities. We'd have cars being run by synthetic fuels. We'd have solar and wind power running most of our power grid. Electric nuclear power would be too cheap to meter. And we play this game endlessly in the United States. The fact is, politicians are very poor at predicting what the technologies of the future might be. I don't know what they might be, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if 30 years from now we run our cars with something other than gasoline. But I'll tell you what, politicians don't know any better than I do, and it's far better to stay neutral, not rig the market, not to favor one group of lobbyists over another set of lobbyists, and let market incentives provide all of the direction we need to move our economy forward given these high prices. Thank you.
All right, let's get started with a little Q&A, and you guys can throw in some more rebuttal if you choose to. But I thought I'd first start with Rick. I guess we'll go kind of in order. And you talked about the use of CAFE standards, that consumers don't necessarily care that much. I wrote down, you said, about MPG standards, and they may not even be aware of fuel economies when they're buying cars. And I'm wondering about the argument Jerry just made regarding the price of gasoline now. Isn't there some point where gasoline becomes so expensive that these consumers start to care, and we don't need CAFE standards?
So there certainly is a point. It's not even a point. There's a continuum, and the higher gasoline prices go, and the more sustained that higher gasoline price is, the more the consumers start to pay attention to the vehicles that they buy and the amount that they drive. But the reality is, study after study has shown that in general, consumers demand a rate of return on the order of 50, 60% when their bank account is maybe only paying 5% on an investment in a more fuel-efficient vehicle, or they won't go there. So in other words, the consumer's not going to shift to the hybrid that costs an extra $3,000, even if it pays back in a few years, or even in a couple of years in terms of fuel savings from operating that vehicle with less gasoline.
And we need to kind of make them. We need to kind of make them. We need to kind of shove them.
Well, that's certainly something that's been proven to work in the 70s and the 80s, and it has widespread benefits in terms of the dual objectives that I'm trying to keep us focused on, and that's economic as well as environmental security.
Okay, Frank, on CAFE, where do you stand?
I'm not an enthusiast for CAFE. I think that what I'm talking about is creating market choices, which I thought would have been something Jerry would support, not dictating to people what they should buy.
Okay. Now, I guess, Jerry, I'm guessing it's pretty obvious where you stand on the idea of making people buy fuel-efficient cars.
Well, if I can, maybe Rick can share with me some of these studies, because the ones that I've seen, like by Molly Espy, who's an economist at the University of Clemson, is that consumers actually act rationally on car lots. And after all, a fuel efficiency is a trade-off between high upfront costs and low operating costs. And that if you look at the purchasing behavior of consumers, all things being equal, what Espy's study, which looked at 2002 purchases for that model year, were that consumers made perfectly efficient and defensible trade-offs between fuel efficiency and purchasing decisions. In fact, another economist named Robert Crandall at the Brookings Institution, no hotbed of Milton Friedman economics there, found that the first go-around where we had an energy price spike from 1979 to 1986, he found that the CAFE standard simply replicated what the market would have otherwise produced as far as car sales and purchases. In other words, to mandate that consumers buy fuel-efficient cars when fuel prices are going up is sort of an unnecessary step.
All right, let me take another tack with you, though, which I guess I'll start with the supposition, which is that global warming is real. And I don't know, I'm guessing you may not believe that. But let's say, for example, it is, and that this is an environmental catastrophe on the way. Can you argue that market forces will help us prevent this? I mean, isn't it the case that in protecting the environment, it's always cheaper to dump your garbage in the river than to take care of it properly? And this is a condition where self-interest cannot, the market, in other words, cannot produce the results we need?
Sure, and the next time you have a program on climate change and you have a pro or con, I'd be happy to participate. But energy independence has nothing to do with that. For instance, for the most part, we're self-sufficient and all energy technologies save oil. Well, what can we use to substitute for oil? Well, we can use ethanol, that's the closest competitor, or we can turn coal into liquid fuels. Each of those options will increase greenhouse gas emissions vis-a-vis conventional gasoline. According to a study from MIT on corn ethanol, that's certainly the case. And as far as
but there are coal fuel cells that would not do that, and there are other technologies that gasification, for example, that apart from
none of which are economic today. Now, if we want to do something about climate change, and it is a significant problem, then the right answer, I think that Rick would probably agree with me, is a carbon tax and let the market decide how best to act. It might respond with nuclear power plants. It might respond with conservation. It might respond with coal sequestration. It might respond with wind or solar. I don't know how best to respond to that signal, but I do know that's probably the best way of going about it. But that has nothing to do one way or the other with energy independence.
Rick has something.
Just first a brief technical point, and then I'd like to comment on the whole question of market-based approaches to reaching these goals of environmental and economic security. Technical point is that fully agreed that conventional grain ethanol is not helping us address the global warming challenge. That's absolutely correct, and it's an example of what not to do in terms of government policy in the energy sector. That said, there are very exciting prospects for other approaches to producing biofuels, including thermochemical conversion, and you might even be able to get to radically reduce CO2 emissions if you take some of the CO2 from that process and bury it underground in what's called sequestration. Anyhow, that said, I think that we do need a market-based approach to reaching these objectives of reducing oil consumption in order to improve our economic and environmental performance. Now, what does that mean? I think there are three things we need to address. First, fully agree with Jerry that we need to have some way to put a price on CO2 emissions, whether that's a cap and trade or a tax. You need the price.
I gave an if-then. I didn't say I supported it. I said if-then.
So in any event, that's step one in terms of market-based solutions is to put some kind of a price on CO2 emissions, which are otherwise allowing, when we don't have that in place, then all of us here, when we emit CO2 by burning fossil fuels, fail to compensate for that. So that's step one. Step two is that we need to pay attention to the fact that consumers are typically not as well informed as they need to be or as rational as they should be when they're making choices around energy efficiency. So just ask yourself this question. Have you ever thought once about the energy consumption of an electronic appliance that you bought unless the government provided some kind of a label or unless there was a standard that kept the worst performing appliances out of the market? Typically, consumers don't have the time to pay attention to that, and it simply doesn't get dealt with unless the government steps in and makes sure that it does and informs consumers and helps to bring the most efficient appliances into the market. Why does that matter? Appliances, by the way, are about half the CO2 problem because of all the coal-fired electricity that we consume. And then there's an innovation
challenge. Do you have something quickly on the carbon tax, Frank?
Well, it's really not on the carbon tax, except that I'm personally skeptical whether man-made sources of greenhouse gases are producing climate change in any appreciable degree. I will say that if they are, it will be a long time before anybody is killed by them. And what worries me is what people that I've been talking about, who I think constitute a present and quite serious danger, are prepared to do to us now. And I think that has a direct relevance to this whole question of what kind of energy policies are we pursuing and whether we're pursuing ones that compound the problem or make it less bad.
Let me ask you a little bit about coal. America's been called the Saudi Arabia of coal. We have 20% of the world's reserves, 268 billion tons. At today's usage rates, it's 240-year supply of coal. And today it's usually burned when scrubbers are used to clean the toxins out of the air, et cetera. But there are, President Bush's State of the Union address said he urged more emphasis on clean coal. Senator Hillary Clinton recently said we should strive to have new electricity generation come from other sources, such as clean coal and renewables. And yet prominent environmentalists differ, like, for example, Dan Becker, director of the Sierras Club Global Warming and Energy Program, has said there is no such thing as clean coal, there never will be, it's an oxymoron. Where do you guys stand on this? Rick?
I'll just briefly comment that coal, I believe, has to be a part of the solution in addressing, in particular, the global warming challenge, and also making sure that we attend to our economic and national security while we're doing that. Coal is indeed abundant in this country. It's cheap. And it is possible to make coal a part of the solution through carbon capture and storage in particular. It's a fairly straightforward thing to explain. You gasify the coal, and then you can take the CO2 and put it underground and keep it out of the atmosphere.
So the NRDC is saying the Sierra Club guy is wrong, basically.
I will
there is such
myself.
a thing as clean coal.
Former Sierra Club guy, by the way, he's gone now.
Let's avoid any particular phrasing. Because I would acknowledge that. Let me give a reason for that, which is that there are still upstream challenges to manage in the coal value chain, right? So if you take care of the CO2 problem in the fashion that I just described, you still have to make sure that coal mining is done in a way that is respectful of the local environment and of labor conditions. I believe that can be done.
Frank, is coal the answer?
Challenge.
Coal is part of the answer to an overall energy policy, and I think it can be done in a manageable way, but it doesn't solve the problem that I think we must focus on most immediately, which is the transportation sector. And that's where we've got to find alternatives, and I think ethanol and methanol are the places we're going to look first.
But coal could be converted to electricity, which could make batteries that could run electric cars.
The more electric cars you have, the more it will be part of the solution.
You don't even need the batteries. You can liquefy coal and turn it into transportation fuel, and the economics of that probably makes sense if the price of crude oil averages about $95 in today's prices over the lifetime of that facility, which, if you believe in peak oil, is almost certainly going to be the case, which means that we will begin to see investments in coal-to-liquid technology if prices continue at this level or go higher, and if the government doesn't stop them. So in other words, if I were to make the case for energy independence, the most realistic prospect for getting there would be to harness coal to move our cars by liquefying it. Now, that's why I don't think it necessarily solves any problems. If I do that, I will incur Rick's wrath because I'd have to sequester the coal, which all of a sudden blows my $95 barrel of oil price estimate. It means that I'm not going to make any money until oil averages $130, $140 a barrel, and that's not going to happen, I don't think, for the foreseeable future. And I probably don't make Frank happy because I don't think bin Laden turns into, a toy manufacturer because we start investing in coal-to-liquid technology. But the point is, I want to get back to the more fundamental premise. Whenever we have these conversations, you have sagely people say, I think coal has to be part of the answer, but it can't be all of the answer. And then somebody else says, well, it can be a small part. And so says, no, it has to be a large part. As if we're Soviet planners drafting 10-year plans for the U.S. economy. I have no idea.
Well, it could just be they're predicting the role of coal in the future rather than...
You do know what? The history of energy forecasting in this country is one that would shame drunk monkeys. If you look back at the number of estimates about what price or technology would be for name the fuel, name the technology, they've been horrifically bad. Václav Smil, who's an academic in this subject, has nailed the point well. So we shouldn't be in the business of forecasting and then rigging markets to make our forecasts come true, because all we will be doing is flushing away consumer dollars and inflating energy prices in the course.
No, but the point I think that Jerry's getting at is it doesn't have to be us who's deciding it, except unless the government interposes impediments to coal being part of the solution. And I think that would be a terrible mistake.
Mm-hmm. Frank, in your presentation initially, you were talking about how this goal of energy independence is valuable, we should pursue it, but I was short on hearing specifics from you on exactly what we should do. Maybe time didn't allow for that, but can you tell us exactly what if you were the energy czar, how you would move us toward independence?
Well, I'm associated with something that Jerry has vilified in other forums, and I'm sure we'll take the chance tonight, called the Set America Free Blueprint, which is a plan that is available at setamericafree.org. A common sense, fairly modest, but I think quite important effort to find places where people who are liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans and independents and national security people and some people on the libertarian side can come together and say, look, these are just sensible ideas. I've talked about two of the key ones being fuel choice. Whether it's gasified fuel, if you can make that work at an economic rate, that's great. I think we will get to ethanol and methanol at economic rates far faster than we will get to coal gasification. But hey, I'm in favor of all of them. I'm in favor of electricity. I've talked about the infrastructure component of this, namely what you need to do to make cars capable of giving consumers that fuel choice. I think as we introduce that in large quantities into the marketplace, you will find people responding. Jerry's fixated on the corn sheiks, I think he called them in the Midwest. How about the guys in 100 countries around the world whose climate would permit them to make large quantities of sugarcane-based ethanol if only we weren't assigning something on the order of a $23 a barrel tax on the imports of those fuels? I mean, it's just crazy. Let the market work. I'm with Jerry on that, except he's not really with it, except to the extent that it's about oil. And let the oil market work. I'm about bringing more fuels to bear on powering the transportation sector as I think the most immediate, the most important, and the most hopefully consequential thing we can make. And may I make just one other point? This isn't about persuading bin Laden to make toys. Bin Laden is determined to destroy this country, and as many of us as he can get his hands on. Don't make any mistake about it. Part of the urgency I assign to this is the people who are enabling him to do that are largely people who are benefiting from the enormous transfer of wealth from this country to places like Saudi Arabia.
Okay.
And if we don't get smart about that and put ourselves in a position where we can do something with the Saudis to stop this, we're going to continue to find the bin Laden problem metastasizing.
Jerry, apparently you only advocate the free market when it comes to oil and not for other products?
Well, I don't know. Letting the market work means letting Detroit make whatever kind of car it wants. If flex fuel vehicles make sense, somebody will make them. If GM doesn't, Ford will. If Ford won't, Toyota will. If Toyota won't, Honda will. If Honda won't, somebody else will. Saab will. Chrysler. Somebody will make these wonder cars that Frank Gaffney thinks will radically transform society, that would provide all kinds of nirvana and milk and honey for consumers. Someone out there will figure this out and make them, if they indeed make economic sense.
All right, actually,
to me,
let's
that's
just stop
what
right
letting
there.
the
I'd
market
like to hear
work
Frank
means.
respond to that.
Well,
Directly.
I mean, if you can strip out the sarcasm, and it's hard with Jerry, but if you can strip it out, the core of this is, can the market really make a decision about building into our fleet, our infrastructure, capabilities that might at any given moment not make economic sense, but that clearly are in the national interest? That's sort of a role that I think government can usefully play.
Frank, I don't mean to let you,
excuse me.
you've had enough time.
No,
Frank.
I didn't get the sarcasm part. I left that out. The government, I think we would all agree, helpfully said we ought to have seatbelts in our cars. The government helpfully decided to put airbags
Frank,
in all
what
of our cars.
percentage of flex fuel cars use flex fuel?
I don't believe that anybody could have said there was going to be a market incentive to having either of those safety features built in. The government had to do it, and I think this is at least as important as
There are
those.
millions of cars on the road that are flex fueled, and virtually none of them use anything but gasoline. Why? Because the cost of the alternatives are wildly expensive.
All right,
You can
Rick
build
wants
all
to
the
get in
flex
here, though.
fuels you
Come
want.
on.
It won't make any difference.
We need to share time. Go ahead, Rick.
Let me just say, I think there's one place where we can probably all agree, and that's that import quotas on sugar make no sense, and that should be removed, and that would allow cane-based ethanol, which is already highly competitive in Brazil, and in other countries it could potentially be competitive, to be a part of the solution to all the challenges we're talking about.
The price for
here.
sugar cane ethanol is $80 a barrel, which works out in BTU sense of $120 a barrel.
Sugarcane
I don't know if
ethanol
it's
is
competitive.
at
Take the
about
tax off.
$40 a barrel if you get the taxes out of the
No,
way.
in Brazil, it sells for $80 a barrel before you even adjust for the differential in BTU content between oil and ethanol.
Moving on,
that's
the question that I wanted to address is, first I want to make sure that we understand something, which is that when you talk about coal to liquids, what you're talking about is doubling the amount of CO2 emissions attached to every gallon of gasoline that you consume. In a world in which we are trying to move towards first leveling off and then reducing by 60 to 80% global emissions of CO2 and other greenhouse gases, that's an unacceptable investment to be making. That's an unacceptable technology path to be locking into. Now, I also want to make a point about the whole question of innovation and what's actually required in order to make fundamental new solutions come into the energy sector in particular. And I think that this has come up in a number of the comments that have been made so far. I want to make clear that simply allowing the market to play out is not going to get us where we need to be in terms of economic and environmental security. We need to set the rules in such a way that the private sector can actually scale up solutions, even in the face of radical volatility in crude oil prices, for example, even in the face of the fact that there are major spillovers of the innovation, the learning by doing that market leaders would be engaging in. So let me give a concrete example. We talk about carbon capture and storage on coal-fired electricity plants. If you're the first mover there that's trying to develop that technology, you need to go through an incredible array of learning by doing in order to make it possible. And you need to do things like develop entire new regulatory structures so that you can get permitted to put the CO2 underground. You need to work with insurers in order to come up with entirely new insurance products to allow you to have some kind of coverage.
We get it.
against
There's
the risks
startup
attached to
costs
that.
associated
Massive
with
startup costs. And when you invest in all that learning by doing, fast followers, your competitors, can come in and take advantage of everything that you've just provided to them. Therefore, it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen unless the government is involved in helping those technologies come down the learning curve, and the government has been involved in bringing all new major energy technologies into
Well,
the
there are
marketplace.
patents, by the way. But
What about combined
let's
cycle
move on.
natural gas?
Let's move on for a
Rick?
second. Frank, I wanted to ask you about the Set America Free, because I saw a 2005 article in which you wrote that it would cost about $12 billion over 4 years. Is that still the price tag about?
I honestly don't know whether it's inflated. I assume it has since 2005.
Okay.
But I would say it's probably at the margins.
And the question that I asked Rick, I'll ask you. At some point with oil getting 70, 80, 90, 100, if it goes much higher, do we still need incentives from the government?
Well, again, there are some things that I don't know will be done without the government saying it ought to be done. There are 5 million of these flexible fuel vehicles on the road. Jerry's absolutely right. Almost all of them are powered, aside from the 15% or so that's being blended into your gasoline right now, by gasoline. But there's no other choice. And at this point, especially with the surcharge on cheap imported ethanol, there's very little incentive for the manufacturers to extend the number of cars or the consumers who drive those cars to find ethanol to
Very little incentive. So you're conceding
need
his
to
argument
create, no,
that it's
I'm
not
saying,
economic right now, but you think it would be good for us to get there so as to reduce dependence on the Arabs and also...
I'm not conceding anything.
So if it were economical right now, it would happen right now.
I'm saying that I think a day is coming when we will find ourselves unable to get gasoline or oil from which to make gasoline at anything remotely like the prices that we're paying now. Why do I say that? I say it in part because of something I said at the outset. I think our enemies have recognized that it is easier to interrupt the flow of oil on which we depend so critically for both our economic security and our national security.
Okay.
Over there.
We're almost
They can get
we're
at
almost out
it.
of
They
time,
can get
Jerry.
at it easily over there.
We're almost out of time. Jerry?
If you don't have every single penny of your disposable income on oil futures, then you're leaving money on the table. If you really think that oil someday in the foreseeable future will be at astronomical prices that make today's prices look like a quarter in 1953, then you should be invested heavily in oil futures, are you?
I am not, because
Why not?
Because you would point out that I'm actually trying to promote my profits.
You just
I
said,
wouldn't possibly do that.
You
Jerry.
just said that you foresee a day in which oil is astronomically priced and we couldn't get it at anything like today's price. If you really believe that, then you should be investing very heavily in oil futures, and I think there's probably people in the audience who can hook you up.
I think it would be unethical for me to do that. I'm making a forecast of what I think is a distinct possibility. It's up to us to take steps, and I think the government has to play
either
a
you have
role
the
in this
courage of your
to
convictions or you
minimize.
don't.
No, I don't have the ethical standards that would cause me to go out and promote a cause that I'm going to profit from. Jerry, I'm sorry, that's just not the way I'm wired. But my point is, the country
So
has
are you
an
predicting it or
opportunity.
not?
I'm predicting that we will have people trying, as they have already tried, to disrupt our oil supply that could have a very profound effect on the price. And we ought to, as a nation, have the good sense, and it isn't enough for the market to say, well, this week it's going to be profitable for me to take that step. It's got to take, I believe, a government mandate to say, build into our cars from here on the capability
If
to
I
use
can,
other than
Wait,
oil.
The
If
last
I can
few minutes are always the best. Please thank Rick Duke, Frank Gaffney, and Jerry Taylor, our panelists this evening. Also, this event was sponsored by Don and Paula Smith, whose philanthropy made this all possible. Also, Don Steves was instrumental in organizing the event tonight. I'm Bob Bowdon. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.